Okay, so I'm super excited about this panel. PBS is a topic that's close to my heart. Having sort of spent about a year and a half of my life looking at it and trying to make it become a reality, it's sort of blown into something that was much bigger than I could have expected. And now I'm lucky enough that we have some of the people that are working on sort of carrying it forward and bringing it to this next stage. I will do a similar thing than we did in the previous panel. I do want to have a lot of participation. I think this is going to be sort of a forward-looking chat. I've made sure that on this panel we have sort of representation not just from the Ethereum ecosystem, but also alternative approaches to how to handle MEV at the protocol layer, as well as in other ecosystems where the trade-offs that people are making in the designing of these systems is slightly different. So I think a lot of the conversation will be focused on trade-offs and focused on like what are the properties that we're trying to guarantee in the systems that we design, and how do we make sure that those properties are good for the users that we're designing them for. So unlike the previous panel, I think it would be quite interesting to hear a TLDR on sort of your current role in the ecosystem, the part of protocol level MEV development that you're focused on, and then you know, how it contrasts maybe in terms of the priorities that you have when you think about designing these systems. Mike, do you want to get us started?
Sure. Hello. Yeah, I'm Mike, if I haven't met you guys. Working on thinking about ePBS in terms of how we can bring it into the Ethereum consensus layer. So I guess some of the main properties we're paying attention to are giving guarantees to proposers that the block they commit to, if they haven't seen it in time, is valid, and they'll get paid for the right to produce that block, even if they aren't in control of the block contents necessarily. We're thinking a lot about how we can give guarantees to the builder. I think the low-carb Crusader kind of whole saga showed us how important builder privacy is in some contexts, and making sure that that they're not incentivized to go outside of the protocol to do something that gives them better guarantees. Yeah, I think that's what I'll say. And also caring a lot about censorship resistance, thinking a lot about how we can get strong guarantees about transactions getting included, even if the validators themselves aren't the ones building the blocks. So, yeah.
Hey everyone, I'm Alex Stokes with the EF, and basically I'm just trying to make sure that all of you don't destroy Ethereum. The like short-term incentives are to just extract as much as you can from the system, but if we all do that at the same time, then you know it looks like we just have like the one super node that we're all battling, and now it's just like a TradFi stock exchange. And we lose all the nice properties that Mike was just talking about that make Ethereum really special. And obviously by extension, like these other ecosystems that we have represented today. So yeah, I mean, it's very tricky. Like, you know, probably what you'll take away from this is just like seeing all these different perspectives, and the fact that like there's no like perfect or like, ideal solution here. Especially, you know, throwing back to Steph's talk a minute ago, there's like just such a vast network. And again, a lot of people in this room are working towards, you know, adding to that picture. And so you have this like very rich diversity, which is really exciting, ton of innovation, stuff like that. But then, yeah, we just have to make sure that, you know, we can keep playing the game rather than just play a few more rounds of it.
Hi, I'm Sam Hart. I work at Skip. Although prior to working at Skip, I worked at the Interchain Foundation, which is kind of Cosmos focused, and I did kind of product development for the whole Cosmos stack, so Tendermint, Cosmos SDK, IBC, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. At Skip, we develop MEV solutions, and kind of more and more we're developing kind of UX solutions for users. And I still am working on quite a bit of infrastructure throughout the stack. So I think I'm on this panel to kind of represent the non-PBS view, and I mean, it's going to be very interesting talking with everybody else here, but Cosmos just comes from a very different place and has different assumptions and is trying to optimize for different things. So you end up with...
How would you describe those things? So maybe in contrast to you know, how things are done on Ethereum, what are sort of the trade-offs that you guys lean more towards on the solutions that you build?
Well, I guess to your point in your previous talk, the place that Cosmos starts from is that these systems are going to be inherently political, and they're going to be kind of divided into very different application functions, user preferences, like that kind of natural sharding is going to occur, and that's a good thing. We should kind of embrace that. So that means that the application is going to be able to express preferences over, the application design, all the way through the MEV supply chain. And really, the thing that we should be, unlike the Ethereum Foundation, like we are less concerned with a single chain going down. That's actually, there are kind of replaceable parts in the system, and we're designing for kind of like aggregate robustness rather than any single chain. So yeah, that communication standard is super important, and actually just kind of listening to user preferences, application preferences to understand what their needs are.
Cool.
Hello, I'm Terence. I am from Offchain Labs. So I mostly work on layer 1. So I am a core dev. So I'm a core implementer. So like Mike and Alex said, so I turn their wonderful research idea into code. So which typically means that if something goes wrong, like people will knock on our door first, and then we're the one that gets yelled at, right? So, so in terms of EPBS, I'm mostly looking at what Mike and Alex are looking at, basically, and we deal with a lot of users, a lot of stakers, about like I think 35% of the stake is running through Prism right now. That's the client that we write. And so about 35% of the block is proposed through Prism. So from our end, we look at, for example, like reorg, right? We want to make sure there's not enough reorg. We want to make sure that every block is successful. That's why EPBS is very important to me, because I think that's basically the next step to better chain security.
Curious, do you have a lens on the Arbitrum block space preference, or are you more?
Yeah, so I'm kind of in this weird position that I work on layer 1, but I also know a little bit of layer 2 because like Offchain Labs pay for my salary as well. So so I don't know. I mean, that depends. Let me know what hat I should be wearing. But from my end, I'm mostly commenting on layer 1. But I'm happy to answer layer 2 questions.
My name is Alex, and I am with Fastlane Labs. We are a MEV protocol that focuses on Polygon. We do things very differently, though. Our focus is primarily on building smart contracts that are aware of the infrastructure, and infrastructure that is aware of the smart contracts. And by combining those two and having them interact in like an interesting way, we've been able to pull off a few things that we're very proud of. On Polygon, we've built a MEV system that is, users just don't get sandwiched. We've been able to like really build a system that's robust, that helps users, and that like at this point right now, if you're looking at the layer 1s, like Polygon of the EVM ones, is going to give you the best execution because it's going to be the one where you're least likely to get sandwiched, and we're very proud of that. We also have the unique distinction, if I may brag a little bit. I believe, and I could be wrong, and I think Skip, you guys are like this too. We could turn off our relay, and our protocol would continue to still work. And I think we're also very proud of that. Like we've designed a system where, through the smart contracts, we've been able to make it so that there's not a reliance. Like we get benefit out of some centralized infrastructure, like a lot of the other systems, because it does help things speed up a little bit. But we could still function even if we turn it off, and so we're very proud about that. But there are some trade-offs, to your point. Like, yeah, it's decentralized, no sandwiches, no reliance on infrastructure, but there's a massive trade-off that we make. And that's based on something that's unique to Polygon, which is the amazing social there. What we've found is that validators on Polygon will not run sandwich bots. There's not a single one of them running a sandwich bot. And because of that, we're able to build a system that assumes and that trusts that validators won't run sandwich bots. Now, if one of them ever turns one on, that might change things for us, because then we would have to start worrying about the fact that that validator might be accumulating stake faster than the others, and that might over time trend towards centralization, which is a serious problem. How long that would take, I'm not sure. I think the EF guys would probably be more suited to answer that question than I. But what we've found is that Polygon is a proof of stake network, and it's been proof of stake for a long time. The validators have been going out raising stake predominantly from institutional investors for a long time, and because of that, there is a strong sense of like social responsibility. Like if a validator starts running their own sandwich bot, like you can look up like all of the major validator operations on LinkedIn. You can find like their CEO's email address. You can like email your senator, you know, about like, hey, there's this guy who's like, you know, stealing money from us. It's this validator right here. Like there's this sense of accountability that is really a result of the way that the Polygon validator set was set up. That is not necessarily the case for Ethereum. That's actually like definitely not the case for Ethereem, where there is a permissionless validator set. But that being said, we're very happy of like what we've been able to accomplish in the environment where our trade-off prioritization is different.
So maybe like one question here is like, on the one hand, you say, okay, you can just message all the validators on LinkedIn. You're like, wow, this is like the most centralized thing in the world, right? Like I can just get everyone into a room and make decisions about protocol changes whenever I want. There's sort of this assumption that Ethereum works differently, that Ethereum doesn't have sort of this set of like, you know, operators that control a vast majority of the network. But my understanding is like there's still very few staking operators and node operators on Ethereum today, and the proportion of solo stakers is well below 10%, if not below 5%. Is that, you know, the correct understanding of how the distribution works?
What I would say is that on Polygon, the stake is, to use like another term, it's relatively sticky. Like once you stake with a validator, you tend to stay with them. So if one validator starts having slightly higher yield than another, the sense that an institutional investor would like do like an entire set of due diligence, bring in their legal team, and like go through that process again, it's an extremely high friction.
But that's the case on every chain, right? Validators are retailers of trust, and that trust is negotiated through sort of contracts and long-term agreements. And so whether you're on Polygon or on Ethereum, that looks very similar.
I want to agree with you, but I feel like I might aggro a lot of the Ethereum people. But yeah, I'm not entirely convinced that Ethereum validators would necessarily sandwich. I mean, we've found that on Polygon they don't, and it would be amazing if Ethereum is the same way. I think that would be great, because right now, if I'm being honest, Ethereum is the worst chain for users. It is the most predatory chain. It's the only chain where validators are like strongly incentivized and perhaps even will be forced to be maximally extractive for users. A lot of the other chains have focused on avoiding that. And I think one of the one downsides of PBS is that while yes, it does really help decentralization, it also enshrines this like terrible user experience, and the only way around that terrible user experience at present is to rely on like centralized third-party off-chain infrastructure to have privacy through your transactions. And if you're correct about what you're saying about Ethereum validators, I think that would be amazing, because I think that would solve a lot of issues.
So I don't necessarily know that the answer is just to ask all the validators not to sandwich. But I think there are some like intermediary solutions that are going to help provide sort of better guarantees. I'm sort of curious from the guys working at the EF, what do you sort of see coming around the curve in the next 6 months to a year in terms of protocol changes at the MEVday sort of PBS level? What are the main areas that need to be improved upon?
Big thing people talk about is censorship resistance. So that was like became quite a hot topic around the merge with various sanctions and whatnot. And you know, I think everyone agrees is a sort of soft spot of the protocol today. So to the extent that we can improve that, you know, over the next 6 or 12 months, like you said, that would be great. It's kind of this thing where it's like we were even talking about this last night. Like MEVday like works just barely. Like it's good and it like works enough for now. And then if anything, it kind of buys us time to like focus on ePBS solutions that might, you know, resolve a lot of the downsides that we see with MEVday today. Yeah.
works just enough. That's like really the bar that I try to hit whenever I design anything. Like just good enough to be passable and allow people to focus on other things.
Well, it's a trade-off, right? Because like you could imagine we put a bunch of like resources into making MEVboost and like the Offchain PBS like really good, and we could almost get to a point where it's so good we don't even need ePBS. And like
so this is a funny story. Like before the merge, I spent like a couple months trying to convince the EF that they should like delay the merge and go straight to like Enshrine PBS, and that like doing MEVboost was just a terrible idea. No one wanted to do it, and so everyone was like, no, like we want the merge, like it's gonna be the next upgrade. We're not delaying this, and so MEVboost was designed exactly for that. It's like an intermediate solution that is sort of good enough to keep us going. I think the insane thing about it is without that one decision having been made, like you wouldn't have all the block builders that are in the room today. I think we'll have in the next panel a block builders panel.
Well, they would be here. They just wouldn't be, we wouldn't have as much transparency into the system, right? So that's the thing where it's like good to have MEVboost. Like it gives us like, again, like insight into what's happening some. And, to the extent that it exists, it does inform a lot of experiments around, or like the ways we think about ePBS. Just having all this data from like relays and things. So like it's good, and yeah, it's good enough right now.
Yeah, so I was saying like I'm personally as much as like I don't like MEVboost, I thought it was a very like it was a very required like step in the middle, because without it, like we wouldn't understand all these like different type of like attacks that has happened in the few months. If we just go straight into Enshrine PBS, I think like that would have been like a bigger problem that we probably have to do some like crazy hard fork like in the middle. So yeah, personally, I'm very grateful of like MEVboost, and because like it basically allows us to learn so much.
Yeah, I also wanted to add, you asked about like what's coming down the pipeline in the next few months. One thing that I've been working a lot on and thinking a lot about is kind of as we do this blue sky research around Enshrine PBS and kind of think about the top-down approach of really fixing this at the protocol layer, we also have the advantage of having the relays already running, and we have kind of this whole ecosystem in place. So we've been working on this thing called optimistic relaying, where we can kind of mold the behavior of the relays to look to kind of both de-risk some of the ePBS design, aspects, but also to make the relays perhaps more sustainable and just better at servicing the builders and the validators. So I guess the overall theme of the optimistic relay roadmap is to remove some of the roles from the relay and replace those roles with a collateral that kind of enforces the builder behavior at the relay level. So I think in the short term, that's like the easiest path to both making relays more sustainable and de-risking some of the ePBS stuff. But longer term, I still hope that we go the ePBS route, but I'm biased.
So there's a few other like approaches to designing systems aside from PBS, right? Like there's a Pepsi that's sort of discussed quite a bit, and then there's also slot auctions that are sort of another sort of design category. I'd love to hear a bit of a discussion or debate around like these different approaches and which ones are the ones that are worth exploring more than others.
Yeah, I feel like we almost need Barnaby up here.
Barnaby, you want to participate? Should I throw the mic over at you?
Okay, well, one thing I would say about the slot versus block auctions, most of the ePBS designs we've been kind of toying around with would probably work with both, right? So this payload timeliness committee thing, which we published recently, like it's not necessarily binding we don't necessarily need to bind the builder to a specific block. We could like bind them to a specific slot and kind of have that design space open up. So I guess I don't see it so much as like an either or. I see it as they have some synergies, but I'll have Barnaby talk about Pepsi a little bit.
Well, in the meantime, maybe I can say something.
Try again. There you go.
Okay. Yeah, it's working.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I've been probably doing the most work flooding PBS at the EF because I've had some concerns, notably around the questions that are discussed now, like this idea of enshrining the market structure of having proposers and builders, that to me was pretty scary. I thought the whole block auction was too coarse, and we have results from Quintus, from the special mechanisms groups guys, who tell us that it might be the case. And so while I was thinking about it, actually, funny story, I read this Atom 2.0 paper that Sam was the lead author on, and it kind of blew open my mind that there was a lot of things, like a much bigger design space than I thought to design this mechanism. And yeah, coming from this discussion, there was this idea of Pepsi, which is enshrining this idea that validators can enter into commitments, but not enshrining the specific shape of this commitment, so not enshrining that it has to be the whole block, it has to be the way that the Ethereum protocol dictates it, like you can enter into any kind of contract that you want. I don't know that it's workable. There's a lot of trade-offs with it. Like it's a much more opinionated version of the market, let's say, that I feel Cosmos is heading towards. And with this idea of, yeah, it's more adaptable, like you can really have these activist solutions of designing yourself what your chain looks like. I don't know that it's fitting for Ethereum, but it really came from this place of saying, yeah, maybe the shape of Pepsi is just too coarse and we need something that's a little more flexible.
There are like there is a latent structure to Ethereum block space that's like starting to form. So I mean, the kind of CR effort is in some ways a kind of modification or like retraction of part of PBS, and then the whole kind of roll-up repricing is another kind of acknowledgement that okay, we have this class of transactions and we want them to behave in a certain way. So you know, if you were to go down a Pepsi route, you know, you might just kind of say the block space is going to be reserved or kind of delineated in a specific way instead of doing everything via market pricing. And I'm not an Ethereum person, so I have no opinion about whether that's good or bad, but just kind of hypothetically, that's what might happen.
If I'm being honest, when I hear Pepsi, I just think of the drink. Are you, just for the people who might not be like on Ethereum all the time, what does Pepsi stand for?
Protocol Enforced Proposer Commitments.
Got it. Thank you.
It's a way to, yeah, I mean, it is what it says it is, but it's basically a way to kind of resegment block space, and that's done on the validator level.
I guess like from my end, I'm mostly looking at implementation. So for me, I want something that's implementable, shippable within like the next like few months. Just because like I'm personally looking at the mainnet and then I see very slow block. I get really worried, and it's gonna get worse with more validators in the queue. So I'm mostly looking at short term, and for short term, it's definitely PBS.
I have a question. Maybe we don't know the design mechanism, but do you guys have sort of an outlook on whether Stephane's more complex picture becomes simpler with ePBS or becomes even more interconnected with more actors?
Maybe no views. Just like abstractly, like a good ePBS will probably like not touch most of those things. Like it will just actually have the one abstraction. And I would kind of consider it to like be a worse PBS, I suppose, if it like touches more stuff, if that makes sense. Yeah, but that, I mean, in sort of the same breath, it's like ePBS, whatever that looks like, should like take this reality into account. Like the picture we saw is happening, and it will only get more elaborate, and so like that's a reality. And like anything that we put in the protocol, and this is part of why we are so careful with like shipping something that's actually enshrined. It could be the case that, you know, we just like copy paste MEVboost, and then, you know, 6 months from now, everyone's trying to sell gas futures, and like no one wants what we have, right? So it's like something you have to do very carefully. Yeah.
In general, when you enshrine something, people can depend on it and build businesses on it, build additional layers. So I would presume it could catalyze some increase in complexity there.
I would also say, if anything, I feel like Steph's picture kind of implies Pepsi's solution might be better because proposers could commit to much more flexible things than necessarily just a full block or even a full slot. Like they could, I kind of like to think of Pepsi as sort of an enshrined eigenlayer. So they could commit to only including a price if an oracle has some value less than $100 or something like that. And that sounds kind of like more like the intent structure than the actual like full transaction structure. So I think if we need that level of flexibility at the protocol level, then Pepsi might be the right way. That being said, I also like thinking of ePBS as kind of trying to firewall off most of the complexity from the protocol. Like we mostly care about stability, like liveness, safety of the L1, and to the extent that we can kind of firewall off the complexity of solvers, builders, searchers, and all their interactions, and just have kind of the simplest way to get all of that on chain, like a dumb pipe, essentially. I also see the value in that too. So I think that's part of the trade-off.
It's still the plan to have validators be able to add like a couple transactions to the end of the block. That was my understanding of the kind of like censorship resistance solution, which kind of is a form of Pepsi in a way. Yeah, so I guess the design space isn't either ePBS or Pepsi, right? Like the kind of inclusion list idea is a specific case of the constraining of the builder's actions in some way. So you can specify something about your block or about the next proposer's block that the builder who builds that block has to conform to. In the inclusion list world, that's enforced at the testing committee versus Pepsi, it would be kind of enforced at the validation, like the block validation level. But that feels more like an implementation detail. So yeah, I agree with you there.
I wanna put Terence on the spot, and I know you tried to duck your representation of Arbitrum in your introduction. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that have been discussed is, okay, what are layer 2s going to do with sequencing? Is PBS model some way that layer 2s can achieve some level of sequencer decentralization? What do you think the future holds there, both maybe from the Arbitrum perspective or more from rollups generally?
Sure. I think I will start. Maybe this is a spicy take, right? Like I think like decentralized sequencer is. I know there has been a lot of talks. There's a lot of people talk about, but like as a layer 2, sorry, this is not a layer 2 panel, but I'm getting there. But like decentralized fraud prover is a lot more important in a decentralized sequencer. So like we have to understand what can the sequencer do, what can the sequencer not do, right? Like sequencer can order your transaction. It cannot censor your transaction, just it can still submit it through like a layer 1 inbox. So the only thing it can do is really just to reorder your transaction to do some MEV stuff, right? Versus like validator can actually like submit like an invalid transaction and steal something and then like basically withdraw to layer 1, right? And unfortunately, in the current state of layer 2, like we either have permissioned validator or like the centralized keys, and then a lot of the contracts, their upgradability sucks, right? So with that being said, I think like decentralized fraud prevention is a lot more important for layer 2 landscape. So let's jump into decentralized sequencing, right? I think like a lot of layer 2 these days all have DAOs, right? So at the end of the day, it's basically the DAO proposal. Like, what does the DAO wants to do? Do you want auction or do you not want auction? If you want auction, what type of auction you want? So I look at decentralized sequencing as like basically just like a bunch of nodes that come into agreements of the order policy, right? I think from the Arbitrum standpoint, I don't want to speak for Arbitrum, of course, or Offchain Labs, and we have seen that we don't want toxic MEV. So this has been kind of the day one standpoint that we don't want toxic MEV. We don't want front running, right? But then now, since I think early February, we released a proposal on time boost, meaning that we are willing to auction off back running, essentially having spam, you essentially bid. So therefore, you have some sort of back running ability, right? And so yeah, so there's definitely a lot of excitement coming out there. I think there's 2 versions of time boost. I think that should be likely in the work in the next few months. And then in terms of decentralization, it just comes down to, okay, how do they come to consensus on what the ordering bid is, right? You can have a BFT style, you can have a threshold committee style, you can even have like, you can just have like a DAO, elect a bunch of sequencers, and then they take turns and stuff like that. So yeah, that's the gist of it.
Okay, maybe one more question from the audience, if there's any.
Hi. This question's more directed to Alex and Mike, but anyone's welcome to chime in. So I was wondering about what your thoughts are on multiple concurrent block proposers, and if that will be practical in Ethereum going forward, or if it's like a consensus overload.
Yeah, I kind of lean more towards the latter. Like, I'd need to see a concrete proposal or design, but like one thing, if you just imagine like, you know, rather than one person's sort of racing to make a block, now like 5 people are, then that just like has this additional like load on the network that we don't really want. You could try to get around that. You could have like maybe just gossip headers or something. But yeah, I mean, like, why do we really want this? It's, I guess, for like censorship resistance. Okay, so like, I feel like there's other ways to do this and still retain this like sort of sequential proposer ordering, and it's like kind of an equivalent design, assuming like you know, inclusion lists are shipped.
TBD.
There are still some open questions there, so like, you know, it's not like a silver bullet. But yeah, it's I mean, it's definitely an interesting like research avenue for sure, and yeah, I mean, definitely if anyone in this room is interested to like look at it from a research perspective, like please join the conversation.
Yeah, I think my intuition here is like ePBS feels like it's kind of adding complexity to an already quite complex thing. And I think people have voiced that concern just as far as like the way the protocol works now is, you know, there's kind of the fork choice rule, and then there's this Casper thing that finalizes behind. Adding ePBS and MEVburn inclusions lists, like all of these things kind of start piling up. And so kind of from an aesthetic argument perspective, I also think it's worth considering, and Francesco, he's not here, but he talks a lot about kind of maybe prioritizing single slot finality and kind of almost not starting from scratch, but rethinking the consensus layer at a more, like a bigger change to the consensus rather than doing these iterative things. I guess the trade-off always is development effort and how feasible these changes are. So I think multiple concurrent proposers would be a huge paradigm shift that would take a long time, and as the protocol like starts to ossify, would only become more hard as time evolves. So
just leave it to EigenLayer to implement all the soft forks, and we can just have all of them running in parallel. Like, that sounds fine to me. I don't see an issue there.
what could go wrong?
Yeah. Let the market solve it.
Do you have any kind of sense on if ePBS would change the burn model of Ethereum? So instead of it being burn on user fees, would you kind of take some of the money which currently goes in the proposer's pocket and kind of distribute that more fairly across the network? Or would it change anything in the burn model?
Could you repeat that?
So would ePBS change, I guess, the burn model of Ethereum? So instead of all that money coming from a builder and going to the current proposer, would you kind of...
Oh, right. It was like MEVburn or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So hot takes on MEVburn.
I can give a quick hot take. I think MEVburn, I've gone back and forth on it. I would say Justin and Domothy are the two like real experts in MEVburn. So if you want the real juicy details, I would talk to them. But my initial problem with MEVburn is that it sort of takes away some of the agency of the validator. The reason for that is in order to, like, I guess, quick overview of MEVburn is instead of the block that pays the validator the most winning the auction, it's the block that burns the most MEV that wins the auction. And the idea here is, as Joe mentioned, it redistributes the kind of economic reward, the economic MEV over the entire protocol rather than just giving it to the single slot proposer. My initial issue with it was, yeah, it takes away the validator agency because now there's a minimum price for each block that actually becomes part of the consensus layer. And so anyone who builds a block at home, they would, if their local block doesn't meet that minimum value, then they have to either pay to subsidize that block, or they have to miss their slot, or you know, actually outsource the block to someone who can build a more valuable block. So that was my initial problem. But Justin's response, and I think pretty valid response, is that if we can have inclusion lists and other kind of ways to constrain what the builder does, then maybe the full like validator agency isn't actually something we need. So I've gone back and forth. I think MEVburn is cool now. I'm team MEVburn. So you want to say?
I have a hot take on MEVburn, which is like, if you actually reduce the amount of contention rather than like try to burn it, you might actually end up at the same result, but without as much work. And so very simple way to do this is like, okay, well, what, like over maybe like 30% of like MEV revenues of validators just comes from like Uniswap LPs, and so Uniswap is now shipping new protocols that are promising to expose less of that MEV, and so is that the right layer at which to solve it, or there's this promise of a lot of the activity moving to layer 2s, and the more that as an ecosystem we leverage external computation to be able to do this market making or this solving, the more the idea of liquidity sitting on a single chain becomes sort of irrelevant, and the liquidity is sort of amorphous or ambient, as some people would like to say it. In those scenarios, there's a lot less contention on the layer 1 settlement because you're not competing for specific state access. And in that case, do you really need to be working on MEVburn, or is that sort of superfluous as a complexity for the protocol?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it kind of comes down to what is Ethereum's block space for, and it's supposed to be for everything, but some things seem to be more important than others, and MEVburn seems like a good solution to me only because it's kind of a non-solution. You just like give it to everybody, and if you're actually like differentiating block space further through layer 2s or whatever, then you can do all kinds of crazy things with MEV. We have a ton of experiments in Cosmos where MEV goes back to LPs, or MEV goes to a treasury, a DAO treasury that votes on where it goes, or whatever. Goes to subsidize validators in the tail end of the validator set.
All right, I'll call it there for this panel. Big round of applause for our panelists.